and I'm delighted to say we've got Julian Allwood here with us this evening to talk about a safe planet in good faith and asking the question, can we live with more restraint, and will we do so? So I'm going to start by with an opening prayer, and this is the prayer of St. Brendan. Help me to journey beyond the familiar and into the unknown. Give me the faith to leave old ways and break fresh ground with you. Christ of the mysteries, I trust you to be stronger than each storm within me. I will trust in the darkness and know that my times, even now, are in your hand. Tune my spirit to the music of heaven, and somehow make my obedience count for you. Amen.
Amen.
Now, we're grateful to Martin Davis for having introduced us to Julian, and so Julian, Martin's now going to introduce us to him and tell us a little bit about him. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be asked to introduce Julian, who's a Cambridge graduate, an Imperial postgraduate. He worked for 10 years for the Aluminium Company of America, and he's now, after going back to Cambridge about 25 years ago, he's now a professor of engineering and the environment at the university there, and he specializes in sustainable materials and climate mitigation. He's a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and he was one of the lead authors on the IPCC's fifth assessment report, focusing on mitigating industrial emissions. And he authored the report Absolute Zero, which many of us remember, which detailed a roadmap to zero emissions without relying on new technology. And this is the sort of main core of his body, which has the slightly alarming title when you first look at it, the Use Less Group. I've known him for some 30 years, first of all in his capacity as a musician, as a singer and a pianist. In fact, it was only last year that he played for a small audience, which was nevertheless very select and also very discriminating, a Mozart piano concerto, which is pretty impressive. His YouTube channel brings together engineering and music to inform and to entertain audiences of all ages. And 7 years ago, he helped 88 primary school children invent a mechanism to allow them all to play the piano simultaneously and create a world record. If you have the time, watch a little 5-minute video on his YouTube channel. I keep coming back for more. It's hilarious. So over to you, Julian. I much enjoyed your book, Promise the Earth, and I'm sure other people will find it equally stimulating after you've had a word about it.
Thank you, Martin. That was overkind, characteristically. Well, I'm really honoured to be here with you. Thank you very much for giving up your evening. This is about the book. Martin's just held up his copy, and I've got one here. And I guess in starting the talk, I can say that I share with, I think, all of you a Christian faith, but I feel pretty shy about talking about it, having had no theology training. So the book came about when I was giving a talk a little bit like this nearly 5 years ago now with Nick Holton, who at the time was Bishop of Salisbury and the Church of England's lead on climate change. And we got on well and agreed that we would try and write this book together. But in fact, it turned out that we were too close to Nick's retirement date and he ran out of time to work on it. So we turned instead to Andrew, who was a friend in Cambridge at the time. And as a result of collaborating with engineering, the first time that's ever happened in our university, he's been promoted to being the Regius Professor of Divinity, or at least I claim that is the only reason that he got this very exalted post. So Andrew unfortunately was tied up tonight, and I therefore feel I'm slightly giving half a talk. And I think the way to do that is that I can try to tell you about the things where I feel I know quite well what I'm talking about, and then would like to open it up to discussion and conversation to talk more about a Christian response where I don't believe my voice should have any more weight than any of yours. So I thought what we've done in the book is to alternate 7 chapters by me about physical reality with 7 from Andrew on the 7 virtues. And this worked out to be quite a nice framing. The 4 classical virtues of courage, temperance, prudence, and justice, and the 3 Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love, gave us a framework that allowed us to work through the threat of climate change, the false promises of the hopes that are unlikely to deliver, reality about what would work, and then our own response to it. So that's the story, the narrative we've tried to put together in the book. And I'm going to follow the physical argument of the book through these few slides. For those of you who did an arts degree, you won't be familiar with this, but those of us in the sciences and engineering can't actually talk without having pictures in front of us. We use the pictures as our notes to remind us of the story we were going to tell. So I will try not to do anything of any technical complexity, but it's the only way I know how to give a talk. So I'm going to start with 4 fantasies and then talk a little bit about reality and then about imagination. That is the structure of what I've got here. And the first fantasy does have a graph in, which is about the response to date to climate change. So the graph on the left, if you remember when you last saw a graph, the x-axis, which I put at the top here, is the emissions of the world per year. They're measured in 1,000 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, have risen steadily since 1992, which is the date when we got together in Rio de Janeiro and agreed that we would cut them. They're now 50% higher than they were when we agreed that it was definitely a priority to reduce them. And you can see that we've had no shortage of attempts to talk about it through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I was a lead author of their 5th assessment report. And you can see them here meeting in Paris in 2015 at the Conference of the Parties, looking very cheerful because they've just made the Paris Agreement. But since then, emissions have continued to rise. So we have not found an international political framework that has led us to cut emissions. And the fundamental mechanism that lay behind a lot of the early political economic thinking about climate mitigation, which was that if only we had a global carbon price, then everything would get rectified. We haven't found the political mechanism to do that. And I think it's kind of obvious that if you were to have a global carbon price, then precisely the same number would see their prices rise as the number who would see their profits rise. So it's very, very unlikely that you're going to get a consensus view on agreeing on something with that economic effect. So in reality, emissions keep rising and there is no global agreement on carbon pricing. So the early hope for a political consensus has not delivered. The second hope, which was very strongly articulated by Lord Stern in the Stern Review of 2005 and 6, was as well as the global carbon price, new technology would bring about a solution to this. So his hope was that the carbon price would signal for the markets to come up with new technology solutions and that this would bring about change in the most painless way. And a more recent manifestation of that thinking is John Kerry, a few years ago now, saying that half the carbon reductions needed to get to net zero will come from technologies that have not yet been invented. You've seen that in every new country that joins in with the global effort to cut emissions. The first thing they do is to invest in new technology. So to see it as an R&D opportunity on the grounds that that might lead somebody to invent a technology that became profitable. So let's just check how that's going. 3 technologies have had a big effect on global warming so far. Wind turbines, and they were operating in the 1880s. That's 146 years ago. Solar cells, they were operating in the 1880s. And electric cars, and they were operating in the 1880s. So the three technologies that have had an important impact on global emissions are not in remotely new innovations. Without any question, they've been subject to continuous development. And we saw that the developments of electric car batteries over the last 20 years have turned them from being very short-range milk floats into the Teslas and exciting vehicles that are correctly now taking over the market. But these completely contradict John Kerry's false hope. The problem isn't invention. The problem of climate mitigation is scale, and scale means getting it to global penetration. We really know how difficult that is. If you think that the world's most inefficient use of fuel is the use of biomass in poorer countries for cooking and heating, and for years and years and years, Oxfam and Save the Children and Médecins Sans Frontières and all the other big global charities have been trying to deploy efficient stoves because we could get much more heat from much less fuel if only we could find a way to equip people with stoves. And the problem is not producing or designing the stoves, it's distributing them in a way that's culturally appropriate and that can be maintained locally. So in reality, no new technologies have yet had any meaningful impact on emissions. That is a very strong statement, but I'm afraid it is true. The things that have had an impact are old technologies that have very, very slowly evolved to the form that we now know them in. One of the hopes of new technology, in fact, I would say the big hope of carbon pricing and new technology, is that it would lead to a solution that was socially acceptable and, in a sense, invisible to consumers and voters. For incumbent politicians, for incumbent businesses, it would be very helpful if we could invent a way to live without emissions that consumers liked, that they purchased within existing markets and through existing channels, that we made in existing supply chains. And the strategy that we've deployed since 1992 is to hope that that technology innovation will emerge and to wait for doing anything else, because anything else sounds rather difficult. So rather than facing the need for societal participation into the journey of change, we have instead hoped that something would come along that took the problem away. And what has happened is that the impacts of the problem have got worse. There are lots of ways that we know that climate change is hurting us. We know about hurricanes in the Caribbean, about wildfires in Los Angeles and San Francisco. We know about drought in countries like Eritrea. And in the UK, we know about things like flooding risk. The government has had to prop up the insurance industry due to the rising costs of flood insurance. And I've been involved in some work over the last few weeks with a group in Hastings who are suffering from landslips induced by the changed weather patterns created by global warming. But when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change looks at the risks of unmitigated climate change, what they say is that the worst risk is to what they call food security, but I think we could be slightly less polite and say food shortage. And I think this graph, which comes from the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, a very distinguished medical journal that produces an expert report once a year on the effects that climate change is having on human health. This really scares me. So the graph shows the fraction of the Earth's land area experiencing drought for, in orange, 1 month per year, in light red, at least 3 months, and dark red, at least 6 months. And you can see that roughly until 2000, those graphs were about level. So between 10 and 20% of the world's land surface had drought, that is no rain, for 1 month a year up until 2000. And in the 25 years since, it's risen to 50%. So if that's a straight line, then it says by 2070, the whole of the world's land surface will be experiencing drought for at least a month per year. And you can see that the other two are rising as well. So when you project that forwards to the impact on crop yields, without drought, the IPCC predicts that crop yields globally on average will reduce by 2% per decade throughout this century, but the drought is only going to exacerbate that. So I think this is a much more urgent problem than we think it is. And the problem, sea level rise, is not the one that's going to get us, nor is the wind or the rain or the fire. I think it is food shortage. And this graph suggests to me that it's coming sooner than we think it is, and quite possibly within the lifetime of our children, or almost certainly our grandchildren. I'm not the expert on food production, so I don't have clear evidence on all the predictors here. And it's a difficult literature to read because the people writing about it tend to be excited about seed technology or irrigation. But again, it's not the invention of new seeds or water pumps that matter, it's their deployment at global scale. And the worst problem is near the equator in the countries that have the least resource, either to initiate change or to buy food if it becomes scarce. So I think food shortage in the poorer countries around the equator is on the fairly near horizon, and that's why we need to act. So delaying action, waiting for new technology to make things easy and profitable so we can continue past lifestyles is greatly increasing the risk that this food shortage will come to us. Well, I've said that new technology has not brought about the change so far that we wanted it to have. And to my mind, very alarmingly, there is now a movement that says, oh, well, new technology hasn't sorted out the problem of climate mitigation, so let's instead turn to new technology to repair the climate. So the topic of climate repair has come up over the last 2 or 3 years, and to my taste is an unhelpful and damaging fantasy. So the types of intervention being discussed, they're most crazy, are erecting an umbrella between the sun and the earth at the focal point in order to shade the earth so it doesn't matter if we have more emissions in the atmosphere. Or alternatively, we could spray chemicals into the upper atmosphere to mimic the effect of volcanoes, which cause more cloud cover, and so create shade so that we can survive even with more global warming occurring. The two reasons why I think this is extremely dangerous are firstly, of course, that we can't validate an intervention at scale. We've never intervened in the ecosphere without unforeseen consequences. And this is a truly terrifying, to me, experiment. But the second one is almost worse, that even giving license to discussion about this idea gives politicians and the leaders of incumbent businesses, the people who are hanging back at the moment, yet another excuse to continue to delay the actions of mitigation. So I'm on the government's Science Technology Advisory Committee for Net Zero that Ed Miliband created last year. And we've been asked to think about the governance of this, and I'm lobbying to treat this as a form of chemical warfare. And I think you can see why that's the right response. If you imagine the newspapers saying there's a Russian ship spraying sulfuric acid into the upper atmosphere over the UK, that would be an absolute red flag headline. And yet around me in Cambridge and in other universities, colleagues are looking at this as if it was a viable option. So I have started this talk by trying to unpick 4 fantasies: that there will be global political agreement with a carbon price, that new technologies will take away the problem, that we can delay action and wait for it to get easy, or that we can repair the climate afterwards. And when I give talks to an audience who can react to me, at this point, they're usually squealing a bit, saying, gosh, aren't you being a little bit pessimistic? Can't you give us some more hope? Well, my response to that is to say, picture a GP surgery with a responsible GP having a patient who comes in and says, well, doc, I'm an alcoholic and I've fallen off the wagon again. And the doctor in response says, oh, don't worry at all. The government is investing in liver repair technology. So keep drinking and the government will come up with a solution to the problem so you don't need to change your lifestyle at all. I don't believe that any observer would look at that doctor and think they were being optimistic. And equally, the things I've tried to unpack here are not to be negative for the sake of being negative. They're to try to talk about the reality that we face, what we can actually do, rather than trying to put our heads in the sand and pretend that a magic solution will come along. So that's motivational, if you like. Let's now talk about what we really can do, so to move towards reality. One of the big, I think, steps in progress that my group has made in the last few years is to realize that all climate mitigation strategies, whatever they are, depend on 3 physical and 2 political resources. The physical resources are emissions-free electricity from either nuclear or renewable sources, carbon storage, I'll talk about that in a second, and biomass. And the 2 political ones are public finance and societal willingness to participate. So whatever your plan is for dealing with climate mitigation, you have 5 resources and you have to work out what trajectory is most likely to fit within the constraints of those resources. So let me start by reviewing where we're at with the 3 physical resources. Here, over my lifespan, very nearly, I was born in 1965, is the global history of energy supply and demand. So the blue line in the middle is the total electricity supply of the world. The units here are, of course, very large, so a little bit inhuman if you're not used to processing large numbers of zeros at the end of your electricity bill. But is how much we're generating. If we electrified everything for which we currently use other forms of energy like oil or gas, then the red line shows how much we would need. So even though the electricity supply is rising steadily, our total demand for energy is rising faster. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that poorer people are getting richer, so they are able to access and use more energy. And the other is that richer people are getting richer and they have apparently an insatiable appetite for energy. The more I read about short duration, long haul flying, the more I understand how people have unlimited appetite for energy if they can get hold of it. The green line at the bottom shows the amount of emissions-free electricity available in the world. So this graph is fundamental to understanding what we can do as we take a journey to net zero in 2050. So 2050 is another 25 years ahead of where we are now. And you can choose any line that you like to extend these 3 lines forwards. But I think if you are remotely sensible about the shape of the curve, you will see that the green line is not going to overtake the red line. So however we do it, we aren't going to have as much emissions-free energy as we would like to have if we all carried on with the ambitions and lifestyles that we've got used to today. Well, don't worry, say the techno-optimists, we don't need to worry about getting rid of oil and gas because we've got a very British magic idea. What we're going to do is hide the emissions under the carpet. So carbon capture and storage is the idea that rather than burning fossil fuels and letting the emissions go into the sky, we're going to put them into a U-bend and then compress them and pump them 3 kilometers underground and store them in ex or used gas fields. And that's a technology that was first commercialized in 1972 and has operated in about 20 or 30 sites since then. Now, the graph on the left shows global progress with this idea of of carbon capture and storage. The purple line shows global emissions. That's actually the same curve as I showed you on the first slide. And you can see how they're rising. And as I said, they've risen more than 50% since we agreed to cut them. The orange line shows how much global carbon storage capacity we've got. Now, think about this, that the oil and gas sector cannot function in a low carbon economy if it doesn't invest in this technology. It is the only get out of jail card for the whole oil and gas sector. And this is something, therefore, that they've invested a lot of money in marketing. What they haven't invested in is capacity. When I show this graph to people, they say, oh, don't worry, this is all exponential. So you're exaggerating. This isn't a straight line at all. It's going to grow. So I got my communications officer to try to explain the graph in an animation. And this shows just the last 13 years. So here is the curve of global emissions. And now to see where we're at with carbon storage, you have to stretch the graph up a bit. Oh, and then stretch it again, and then again. And finally, there we can see the amount of carbon storage capacity that we've got in the world. So again, I don't know your technical background and how much statistical forecasting you have got used to doing over your lives. But if I were to show this line to a primary school, they would call it a straight line at zero, and they would forecast that it's going to grow to zero by 2050. I think that would be a reasonable forecast. If I zoom in 1,000 times, which I have done on the right, you can see it's not really an exponential curve. There is a little bit of growth, but it's absolutely tiny. Capacity is also slightly misleading. We don't actually use all the capacity available. So the delivery at the moment is that we capture around about 0.06% of all the world's emissions per year. So let's again call that zero and say this might be useful later, but in the time frame that we have to get to zero emissions, it's not going to scale. Well, what about biomass? We know that we love buildings made out of wood, and we've installed burners of biopellets in our homes, and Drax, the power station in the Midlands, has converted to burning biofuels. So surely that's going to be a great answer as well. Well, the trouble is that coal and gas are decades, millennia of biomass, the energy content of biomass compressed together. So they have a high energy content because they're made out of thousands and millions of years of biomass, all densified. To try and give an idea about that, the graph here shows the green line is the total global harvest of biomass at the moment. And you can see what we use it for. We use in orange, that's what I referred to a moment ago, that's poor people using wood for cooking and heating. The bulk of our biomass is used for feeding animals, so that is the strongest argument for adopting a more vegetarian diet, is to release some biomass from animal food. The red is what we as humans eat, and the brown is wood for fuel or structure. If we were to replace all our existing uses of oil in transport, we would need the harvest to go up to this amount, the brown line. And if we were also to replace all our electricity with biomass, we need to go up to the dark green line at the top. We simply can't do that. Crop yields are going to go down by 2% per year every decade this century. And currently 6% of the emissions of the world come from deforestation in the southern hemisphere, where poor people cannot grow enough food without cutting forests down. So there is no possibility that biomass is, at a global scale, going to make any measurable impact on global emissions. And that's fairly sobering, because out of those three physical resources I said, actually, all we've got to play with is emissions-free electricity. There isn't any carbon storage, there's no spare biomass, and we aren't going to have anything like as much electricity as we like to have. But at least we now know what we're trying to do. So the consequence of that is we must embrace restraint. And restraint is a very, very difficult word to pronounce. And in fact, if you've been elected as a politician, you can't get the word out of your mouth. And I sympathize with that, because I don't want to go campaigning around the streets of Ely, where I live, promising people that they'll have a better life if they vote for me. And I genuinely admire the people who've got the chutzpah to do that. And I understand that if they said, I'm very sorry, but the only way to make a safe future is for you to use less energy, then at the moment nobody would elect them. But it doesn't make any difference to the fact that it's true. So does it actually mean the end of life as we know it if we use less energy? Well, the one topic that comes up in political discussions is the idea of efficiency, which is imagined to be that there might be a new electric motor or a new petrol engine, which somehow gets much more useful work out of the energy goes into it. But if you think about it, the companies that make motors and engines have done nothing for the last 150 years except trying to make those devices more efficient. So no, there won't be substantially more efficient electric motors or petrol engines. We've done that part of the journey. However, we could swap the way we do things. And the best example of this is to switch from using a gas boiler to using a heat pump to heat our homes and offices. That's a really good idea because we need much less energy to do it. And as it happens, heat pumps are electric, so they are compatible with our journey to a low carbon, low electricity future. What about the equipment within which we put motors and heaters? We can't make the car engine much more efficient, but we can jolly well make the car more efficient. And that's because the car weighs 12.5 times more than the people that are in it. So the average car on the roads of the UK weighs currently 1,500 kilograms. And if I say that the average adult male, as most drivers are male, weighs 80 kilograms, then it's 1.5 people add up to, or sorry, it's 12.5 people add up to being the weight of the car. Is it in denial of the United Nations Charter on Human Rights that we drive a smaller car and go slower? No, it isn't. And from what we know of the Beatles and Twiggy and Mr. Bean, people who drive smaller, slower cars have a better life. So it's just a cultural habit that we've got into the idea of driving large, energy inefficient cars. It's not in any way a requirement of having a good life. Material efficiency is the same question turned to the way we use materials, and that's where I've spent most of my career. It turns out that because we make steel and cement in particular with such extraordinary efficiency, we make more than 200 kilograms of new steel for every person alive on the planet every year, 3 or 2.5 times our adult body weight. Then we use it wastefully. On average, the commercial buildings of the UK, our offices and shops and schools, are built with more than double the amount of material required to meet our safety standards. But we know the safety standards are all extremely conservative. And we do that because it's cheaper. Labour is expensive, so it's expensive to design a building well, but it's really cheap to buy extra material. So if we can use more material and less design time, then that currently looks like a good solution. We can do much, much better with that. And I've been working hard in that area for the last 20 years, also finding various innovations to support it. Could we use our existing equipment better? Well, of course we could. You know that when you're on a train at lunchtime, trains are full at commuting times and they're empty the rest of the time. But we run freight trains on the same lines. And in the UK at the moment, you can't mix freight and passengers. If we could reorganize our trains to put parcels and packages on the same train that people are on outside commuting hours, we could get much more use out of the same amount of energy. You could also think that the average journey in a car in the UK has 1.5 people in the car. It's got 5 seats, and the average car is used for 4 hours a week. So we don't need anything like as many cars, and we don't need to have anything like as many journeys. If we doubled the number of seats, so if we got up to 3 people in the car on average, it would halve the total emissions of all of our car journeys. And we could get round to doing that, and we might make some more friends while we were doing it and have some interesting new conversations. We could find different ways to reach the same end. So a very obvious one here is that because of what I've said, you'll see that there is no option for zero emissions flying in the foreseeable future. So that means that we have one generation to shift our habit of flying to other modes of transport, in particular to the train. And that's a really good switch. If you make that change, you cut your emissions probably faster than any other action that you could take at the moment. Or we could go directly for the difficult word and talk about restraint, choosing to consume less, which might mean using the old building or adapting the old building rather than knocking down and replacing it, Or, as happened in Japan after the Fukushima disaster, it could be a collective effort to turn the air conditioning down just to reduce the total energy bill, because at the time there was an energy support shortage going on in Japan. So living with less does eventually involve restraint in some activities, and we've got no choice about flying or ruminants, for example. But in many cases, it just means doing things slightly differently to the habit that we've developed. I was at a conference in Cannes in the Riviera 3 years ago, which was very nice. Obviously, I was working very hard indeed, and I hardly noticed the delightful scenery, beaches, restaurants, and other distractions at the Riviera. I was concentrating on the conference talks. But just briefly, as I walked past the harbour where all the massive plastic boats that are the success story of wealthy people in the Mediterranean are parked, what I realized is that you cannot have a big enough boat. Whatever boat you've got, as you drive into the marina, somebody's got one just a bit bigger. So however satisfied you are with your boat, that satisfaction can only last for a short period before you start thinking, if only I had another 3 feet, I could get a bigger parking space, I'd be nearer the front, more of those attractive young ladies would come and have a gin and tonic with me on the back. A bigger boat would be better. You know how human that response is, and it's utter rubbish. It doesn't reflect any of the values that we actually care about. So the second consequence of what I've said is that if politicians and the leaders of incumbent businesses can't pronounce the word restraint, and for now they can't because collectively we aren't going to vote them in if they do so, then they cannot be the leaders or the sole people responsible for solving the problem. We need other agents to enter the fray, and that is us. So it's us in the sense of individuals as the beginning of a social movement. Every single thing that we do that contributes to restraint is a beacon that lights a little flame that will allow other people, it will make it easier for other people to follow us. But us institutionally, we are short of national institutions who talk in any terms other than economic welfare, as if income was the sole determinant of all human happiness. We absolutely know that's not true. And as the churches have lost their national voice, we're short of people talking institutionally to say, no, income isn't the only determinant of a good life. There are other priorities, and we should be championing those as well. So we know now that the government cannot on its own solve the problem because it can't activate all of the required actions. So we, both as individuals and as members of a body, can be part of a journey to bring in a larger group of agents. Well, I'm nearly there before opening up to discussion, and I want to end on imagination. And I think I want to do this in two ways. The first one, which I've hinted at, is that living with less is an opportunity, and it's a commercial opportunity as much as it is a personal one. I've spent most of the last 5 or 6 years leading a big multi-university project called UK Fires, where we were trying to articulate the entrepreneurial opportunities for setting up new businesses that profit from delivering things that reduce our demand for energy and materials. As one of our actions there, we have been setting up startup companies. We're the 6th one we're just in process on at the moment. Some of them didn't get there. So we had a brilliant idea for recycling paper, which is that old paper has nothing wrong with it. The only reason we throw it away is that we don't want to read it again. And we found that you could remove the print from office paper by unprinting it using a particular laser to blast the print off. And it worked a treat, but we couldn't find a way to make that particular laser cheap enough for people to buy at scale. So that one we had to abandon. But we've got 2 going really well. One is that we found that the world's car companies on average throw away as much metal as they use. That's because the car is made out of sheet metal, which the car companies buy flat. But as you know, cars are made out of curvy shapes. And to form the flat sheet into a curvy shape, turns out you have to shape it in a particular way that leads to a lot of waste and we invented a way that would allow you to reduce the waste by 3/4. So that's going gangbusters. We've just had our second big funding round, and we're in the process of getting our first commercial tools into real production there. We also found the world's first way of recycling cement electrically and without emissions, and that one, you can imagine, is going really well as well. But actually, the ones I'm involved in are, for me, fun, but they're really flags that I can wave to the government and say, look, there is a huge opportunity space that you're not in, and you'll only see it if you stop pretending that magic beans fertilized by unicorn's blood, carbon storage, is going to take away the problem for us. So there is real opportunity here. And also, there's imagination in how we live. And really, that's what Andrew's half of the book is about. So I can't speak for Andrew in any way, but I picked out one of his chapters, his chapter on prudence, which he frames as a word of responsibility. And he quotes Iris Murdoch. Andrew is somebody who has read everything and seems to be able to remember it. So unlike in engineering, where we have to draw a graph to be able to look each other in the eye, whatever you say to Andrew, ideas flow out that connect you over the whole intellectual history of the world, through to the inner core of your soul and out into your wider vision for how you'd like the world to be a better place. It's amazing. So Andrew, quoting Iris Murdoch, draws a distinction between fantasy, which he says is treating the world as we want it to be, not how it is, and imagination, which is being open to the world as it is, even when that's awkward or difficult. So I think what I want to give you out of this talk is the second of those, to say we've got to face the fact that it's a bit awkward or difficult, nowhere near as awkward or difficult as people would like to believe. The ones who are saying don't act will wait for technology to take the problem away. But there are some things that we cannot replace, and for a period we're going to have to restrain ourselves. So if I translate that imagination and fantasy idea into physical reality, it is a fantasy that we can deal with climate change without social or societal participation, without disrupting the economy. We simply don't have the time to invent technologies and to scale them up to allow the oil and gas industry to continue, to allow aviation to continue. Maybe they'll come back, but there has to be a period when we restrain ourselves from those recently acquired habits. We have no choice about that. But with imagination, we have 4 particular actions which are urgent in our private lives. Our use of petrol cars and gas boilers. There are technical substitutes available, and whether we can do that depends on our financial position, on the timing of when we last bought a car or a boiler, on the other constraints around us. I cannot prescribe a route by which anybody should make this transition, but of everything in our personal life that we can prioritize, those are the 2 things on which it's worth investing money. I'm afraid that not using carrier bags, using less cling film, putting newspapers in the recycling bin are all virtuous things, but they don't make a substantial difference to global emissions. Petrol cars and gas boilers, replacing them with electric cars, with electric heat pumps, insulating the house so you can use a smaller heat pump, sharing the car with friends, having more people in the seats and buying a small car and driving it more slowly. Those are the big impact activities. The other 2, aeroplanes and ruminants, that's beef, lamb and dairy, there are no technical substitutes. So for a period, we have no options but to phase those out of our life. I find it very difficult knowing how to talk about this, because I know that if I say what I personally have done, it tends to draw 2 responses. One is either you've only done it because you fail, or you've done that, but you haven't done something else, so therefore you're a hypocrite. So I'm not sure how helpful it is to talk about the choices I've made. I flew a lot earlier in my career, and just before flying to Japan in 2012 to give the opening talk of the conference called Zero Carbon Kyoto, I met Kevin Anderson from the University of Manchester, who'd just come back from China on the train. And I asked him about that, and he said, well, of course I did. You can't work in this area if you continue to use planes. And that stuck with me as I flew to Kyoto and back 48 hours later. And I realized he was right. I could do nothing else. So the flame that Kevin lit for me was unquenchable. It took me 3 years to phase out commitments I'd already made, and that will be different for all of us as to what the journey of change is. But it has turned out to be a very good thing. I can travel freely in Europe by train, and I enjoy doing so. And I accept all invitations to speak in Asia and America, but I do it online. And that, fortunately, is perfectly satisfactory for where I can contribute. I have other stories that I could tell about other things I found easy or difficult, if that's useful later on. So there is some restraint, but there's no restraint in joy or friendship or wonder or creativity or compassion or music or sport, in all the things that matter most. If you interview people in their last year of life and ask them what they really value for their life, absolutely none of them mentions income or the boat in Cannes or the number of short-term, long-duration holidays that they've had or not had. They talk about family and relationships. Of course they do. That's what matters to us. So to deal with a low carbon or to make the transition rapidly, we need no restraint whatsoever in all the things that we value. And again, this is why we collectively have a voice that I think we could use better, because these things don't appear in economics. They don't occur in economic metrics of welfare, but they are what matters to us. Everybody my age, and I think many of you are around my age, has been dealing with dying parents for the last 5 to 10 years. And those of you older than me have already been through that, I suspect. And in no conversation that I've had with any contemporary thinking about that journey has anybody whatsoever mentioned cost, monetary cost. The whole issue is about love and compassion, and it speaks to who we are infinitely more than how many journeys we've made in cars or how hot the interior of the house is. And of course, we have to keep it warm to keep the old people comfortable. But I think, I don't need to over-articulate that. So there is no magic formula for this. I can't prescribe a journey of restraint. In a public forum, I can invite people to think about it. I can't bring this in as a component of government policy or even advice to government, although I raise it in every meeting of the committee that I've just mentioned because it's so important. I think restraint is a shared journey. Were Andrew here, he would be able to give us more of a theological framing for it. And I suppose with a tiny economic plug, I could say, well, if you buy the book, you'll be able to read Andrew's very helpful words on that topic. But I think at that point, I would like to stop talking and very much look forward to talking with you and sharing ideas about how restraint can be a shared journey. So thanks very much. I'll stop sharing the screen there and look forward to having a discussion.
Thank you so much, Julian. Julian is going to answer questions, discussion. If you want to ask something or say something, it's most helpful if you put your virtual hand up and then you'll show up on the top. And while the hands are going in there, Julian, I just want to say what you said resonates so much with a lot of what Green Christian is trying to do. Even to the extent that for some years now, one of our major planks of what we do has been a program called Joy in Enough, looking at the economics, the crazy economic system we currently operate under, but looking at it with a way to be joyful in sufficiency, sustainable sufficiency, my late husband Edward used to call it. So thank you for that. Right, questions. Julian is going to field the questions himself. So put your hand up and we'll have you come in. Must be somebody.
There's somebody. Tony and Priscilla are waving a hand.
Ah, right, okay.
Yeah. Julian, do you find that your church is thoroughly on board with making changes, seeking to be exercise restraint? Or is there a significant number in your church who still don't seem to have got it?
Gosh, I think that's a really good question, Priscilla, and nobody's ever asked me that one before. So I live in Ely, just north of Cambridge, and I go to the cathedral. I love the services, but I would say the sense of community is quite weak. I've been going for about 7 or 8 years, and I can name very few people there, which may be that I'm not a very good person at meeting other people. Sadly, there aren't very many people in my position, if you like, professionals still at work, are a relatively underrepresented group there. They have asked me to give, I gave a talk a couple of years ago on this theme, and I'm doing a breakfast meeting with them in a couple of months. So I think then I may be able to engage with them. They have taken the Arosha Eco Church program, and I think they've got a gold medal for that. So there is a community doing things. But I think the Arosha program is slightly more general about the environment and not quite taking the very specific message that I feel I have to share. So they talk about a wider range of environmental concerns. I think hoping that by bringing people in, it will build a community of people who are more environmentally sensitive. And I just don't know if that is the case, or if trying to target the message rather narrowly on climate helps to help people prioritize. I came across a survey on public understanding of climate mitigation a couple of years ago, which asked people to rank various actions for their impact on the climate. And the public at the time believed that the most important thing they could do was recycle the newspapers. And the second thing was to eat organic eggs. Now, in fact, that's a totally unrelated issue. It doesn't have any impact on climate change whatsoever. And I sympathize because of the word green, sustainability, environment gets mixed up. So I think I'm trying to narrow my focus. And I would say, therefore, I don't have a strong voice yet in the community of the church I go to. And I think your question is provoking because probably I should try harder. Mark Dick, I can see, has a hand up.
Yes, Julian, thank you very much for a very clear presentation. That was great. I would be just interested in your interaction with advice to government. Do you find yourself clashing with the economic growth mantra that basically all the government eggs at the minute seem to be in the economic growth basket? That seems to be the answer for everything from their point of view. And how do you navigate around and against that?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think there is a degrowth movement around, and there have been a group of economists promoting that and others trying to add their weight to it. But I can see that politically that has no traction. Politicians simply, in the same way that they can't pronounce the word restraint, I don't believe that you could get elected if you promoted degrowth. So I guess I wonder whether that's part of this idea about saying government can only do certain things and we need other agents to lead other activities. In another way, the reason that I'm so enthusiastic about the startup companies that I've been involved in is slightly to be able to say, yes, I agree that the oil and gas companies has to close, but look at all these exciting growth opportunities over here. And what the politicians I've talked to say is that they can accept that. They need to take good news stories. And if in the background there's a bad news story, i.e. I'm promoting this thing that's going to go really well and quietly somebody else is going to suffer, then that's okay. So I think there's an element to which I can promote growth and be compatible with the story I've told. But I think I also sympathize with them for being unable to pronounce those words and get elected at the moment. David Patterson has a hand.
Thank you. At the same time as we're talking about going towards net zero and that sort of thing, we seem to be, on the good ship net zero, we seem to be attaching depth charges in the form of AI data centers. what's the sort of thinking around that if you sort of see the fairly phenomenal consumption that seem to go with those? How does this fit in with what you've just been talking about?
Yeah, great question. If you look on the pages of the International Energy Agency, who are the best global source of information, and look up data centers there, their reports say that for all of recent history, all data centers worldwide have used 1.5% of the world's electricity, and the fraction has not risen. And that's because as their number has grown, their energy efficiency has improved at the same rate. So, so far, all public reports of data centers being big have been misleading. They've been small. And for example, when the Absolute Zero report was debated in the House of Lords, Baroness What's-Her-Face, who set up lastminute.com, talked about how bad she felt about setting up a website because that was causing more emissions than flying that they were setting through it. No, it wasn't. It was a totally different order of magnitude. The flying was the problem, not the website. So the question is about what happens next. So will the data centers grow at absolutely massive rate? We know in some areas they have. So in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, data centers now consume 20% of all national electricity. And that is true in some states of the US as well. So the global figure of 1.5% is averaged rather than true everywhere. I heard from somebody working for Siemens just last week that Siemens sell gas turbines, that they now have a full order book of gas turbines, all of which is motivated by generating electricity for data centers. So that would support the concern that you've raised. And there are PhD students around me in the department working on this question. So I think if all the planned growth occurs, it will be a major problem. But up to date, it has not been a problem and it's been oversold. So I'm just don't know what's going to happen next. Robbie Spence.
Thank you. I love the talk, and I suppose I just want to pick up on one thing, which is what you were saying about how the elected politicians can't pronounce the word restraint and they can't say the word degrowth because they know they wouldn't get anywhere if they got elected. So that poses the question, well, who are these alternative political actors, non-elected, non-MP level, who are going to be the engine of change, if there is going to be such a thing? And my take on that, which is why, because I want to ask you, I want to throw back at you your very well articulated thing about carbon capture and storage is a mirage, and say, well, maybe if you're suggesting that there's going to be some sort of extra parliamentary political movement that's going to rise up and bring in the kind of restraint or degrowth or other systemic changes, not just the change your light bulbs and get an electric car, individual actions, I mean the systemic changes. Well, where's that going to come from? Because what I see, I mean, Zach Polanski is actually trying to change the landscape, and he's been vilified for being anti-Semitic, even though he's Jewish. The people that broke into the Elbit factory, I know that's about Gaza and Palestine, but they've been absolutely crucified in the media, and their trial was totally up there. So, I mean, this is what happens. I mean, we saw it with the people that got on the M25 gantry. They get crucified. So, I mean, if they're just a few of them, they're not going to be any good. Then they're going to be good, but then they're going to get crucified. So we've got to have a broad mass of people on board. And if you can get a broad mass of people on board, well, then the elected politicians are going to do what the broad mass of people want. So I kind of see there's a bit of a paradox or a bit of a contradiction in what you were saying about where these extra parliamentary activists are going to come from. And I wonder who you think they are.
Good. Well, that's a pretty easy question.
Oh, good.
Thank you. I think that's I completely understand your point. I think 100 years ago, we could probably have pointed to the two big churches and say that they had that voice, they had the presence and power to do it. And I don't think they do. I'm astonished how revealing that I've written this book with Andrew generates, and the implication, therefore, that I'm a Christian, has generated not just antipathy, but actual antagonism as the default response in my department. And it goes hand in hand with sexual abuse. So that is now the knee-jerk response that I've received to aligning myself with Christianity, is immediately somebody mentions sexual abuse, which is disproportionate. There have been some truly terrible cases, but it's of course not a reflection, I think, on the average in the institution. It may be that the churches could develop a voice. The Pope did do very well with Laudato Si. It strikes me that what he did not do was say, and therefore, what should you do? And there was an appetite for that. And so that was partly what we had in mind with the book. Similarly, Greta Thunberg was terrific on the statement, somebody should do more now. But what she didn't say is who should do what. And again, we're trying to articulate that to give her more armor in the future. One group that represent a hope for me, I came across the construction team of Anglia Water, who are one of the big seven water companies of the UK. And they looked, for personal reasons, they looked at their environmental footprint and reckoned correctly that pouring concrete was their main impact on the environment. So just amongst themselves, they started saying, well, how could we pour less concrete? And over time, they started looking at each brief they were given. Typically, the brief was the pumping station in some area is too small, knock it down and put a new one in. And they started questioning the brief to say, well, could we adapt it and give it more capacity without replacing it? And they built up confidence without telling anybody what they were doing until they had the weapons to go to the board of directors and say, we've got a new strategy. The goal of the construction team is not to build anything. And you can see how that's rather empowering in a company, because that team then had a new identity. I led a working group in Tesco's on a similar theme, trying to build a new Tesco out of the components of an old Tesco, and watched the same kind of energy develop. We were unlucky with that one because just before we went to the board, the director of construction changed jobs, so we lost our champion to make it happen. But I think those examples are a scale where, as individuals working within a group, we have slightly more influence than we think we have, and that we have the chance to start building momentum. So I haven't got an easy answer, Robbie, and your question is very well put. But I suppose another one would be to look at Gandhi and to see that the individual who championed and exemplified what he was speaking about in his own life created a societal movement that took over the government of the day. That one is more radical than we need, because I'm not calling for the overthrow of the government, just a little bit of reality about what the options are. And I think I can have hope that there could be a collective movement making a Gandhi-like procession in the right direction. So thank you. A really good question. Barbara.
Richard Baker did have his hand up. Richard, do you want to come in first? Richard, are you still here?
Yeah, I took it down, but maybe you'll prompt me to ask the question. I took a career break and started off by doing a master's degree in behaviour change and sustainability, because it seemed to me that what we need is the behaviour change you're talking about. One of the things that really depressed me about that experience was the time and effort and ineffectiveness of most behaviour change programs. And I just wonder if you applied the same rigor to your analysis of why technical solutions won't work, to your analysis of the potential of behaviour change, whether you might come to the conclusion that they're not a solution either. I must say, for a lot of personal and faith reasons, I'm completely sold on the idea of restraint, but I'm not convinced that it's going to solve the problem. because of the time it takes to develop solutions, if there's one thing that takes longer than developing large-scale technological solutions, it's developing large-scale behavioral solutions.
I get the point. On that very last point, I have some evidence to challenge you. We looked at the fastest transitions of new technologies and the fastest transitions of behavior change. And so we compared the introduction of gas turbines in the UK, wind turbines in Denmark, nuclear in France, with the phasing out of the ozone hole, of CFCs driving the ozone hole with lead in petrol, with asbestos. And in the behavioral change case, what we discovered was that there's a 10-year lead time required from when the government says there are no other options, we've got to change our behavior, till it starts. Then the rate of adoption can be as fast as the rate of penetration of the technology changes. And for the technology changes, the upside was longer. So in some cases, it was even up to 100 years from where we invented a technology till when it started growing. So just in that example, we have some evidence to say that behavior change can
So in those examples, behaviour change was actually brought about by government legislation, wasn't it? It was government legislation to reduce hydrocarbons in fridges and to reduce lead content in petrol. So actually, those are government-led innovations. But you're actually saying that you don't think the government can lead this.
Well, yeah, good question. But I think the government action came on the back of a societal wave calling for government action. So I don't think that's totally incompatible to say we haven't got to get to the point of overthrowing the government and throwing out the British Empire. We've got to get enough people that it's then something that politicians can join in. Climate is fundamentally a health and safety issue. So the end point of everything we're doing is to regulate against greenhouse gas emissions as a health and safety problem. It shouldn't be a problem of economics. And, nobody, even in America, is calling to make asbestos great again. So, we have, even without knowing the science, all agreed that asbestos equals bad. And I think that's where we're trying to end in our greenhouse gas regulation. So it seems to me the societal question is the journey to getting there. I think the other thing, I agree with you about some of what I've seen about behaviour change. I'm speaking a little bit cautiously because I can see that Tim Cooper, who is a professor of behaviour change, is on the call, and he knows so much more about this than I think. Rather than letting him in, you should invite him to give the next talk. My concern about what I've read on a lot of other people's work on behaviour change, not Tim's, is that it is behaviour change in the status quo. So if nothing else changes, are you prepared to fly less and take the train? And most people say no. Well, that's hardly surprising. But if you say it's not the status quo, but there is actually an urgency about health and safety, about making this change, you can be an initiator of change, which makes for a better world and so on. I think it can be presented in a way that makes it more compelling rather than just given the choice now with today's technologies and with no other change to the incentives, will you change your behavior? Most people say no, but I think that's the wrong question.
Thank you, Richard. Julian, it was just a question in the chat from Rosie Lacton, and this will be the last one. I'm sorry, Tony. This will be the last question. So Rosie asks, she says she wonders if unrestrained growth actually leads to a sort of fear, which is handled blindly by seeking yet more. Psychologically, the benefits of limits restraints may be to provide a sense of security. Is that got any traction?
That is such a good comment. I think that is, Andrew does resonate along the lines of those comments in one of the chapters. He talks about Lent and also Ramadan and other religious forms of restraint as having that precise function, that it is to remind ourselves of the things that cannot be brought from continuous growth and increasing demand. So, Rosie, I'm really sorry. I feel totally unqualified to answer. I agree 100% with what you've said. And the, Mr. McCorber's idea of living within your budget is a liberation. I think you mean something bigger than that, actually. It's not just financially, but spiritually, knowing that that's not the thing that buys you security. I completely agree with. Working out how you articulate that in a way that is useful to people outside the conclave, I think is really important, and I don't think I have the skills to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian, very much. I'm afraid we are coming to the end. What's been a fascinating talk. The final thing we do is to have a final prayer before we say thank you and goodbye. And Martin, who started us off by introducing Julian, is going to lead us in the final prayer. So here he is.
Thank you, Julian. We'll just have a moment of silence while we reflect on what Julian's been saying. Creator God, we commit ourselves to love and cherish the beautiful gift of the earth, our common home. To have respect for one another, for earth and its creatures. To do our part to stop further decline in the health of our planet by the way we live our lives. To be grateful for the beauty and goodness of creation around us. To be thankful for Mother Earth, who nourishes us every day. And we make this commitment that together as one family, we may always sing your praises. Amen.
Thank you very much, Martin. Just a brief notice that the next workshop is on Wednesday, the 3rd of June. It'll be a workshop with Wildcard, who are working to wild the countryside and get the Church of England involved with that. But finally, Julian, enormous thanks to you. That was a stellar talk and much appreciated, as you'll see by the hands floating up through the air. Can we give him a virtual round of applause? Thank you so much for sharing your
Thanks, Julian.
Thank you.
Thank you all for giving up your time. It's very good of you.
All right. Well, goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.